I think now we're going to hear the patient perspective and why we need to really figure out what these barriers are and how we really should overcome these for our patient population. So, Paul Anderson, thank you so much for coming. We appreciate it.
Good morning. I'm Paul Anderson, Angela's dad. Over here is my wife, Wanpen, Angela's mother. I'm a retired postal worker. Thank you for inviting us here today to tell you about our beautiful daughter, Angela, and her shortened life. Her story may make you laugh a little, it may make you cry, and I hope it will inspire you to continue your work by putting a human face on your research. It's been almost 9 years since Angela died. If someone had asked me 9 years ago to speak to a bunch of smart people like you all, I would have said, no way. But I've already faced the worst thing that a parent can face. What do I have to fear? Wanpen and I were infertile for 14 years before our son Tim was born. 2 years later, Angela was born on St. Patrick's Day, 1993. Both were born using a special procedure called GIFT, gamete intrafallopian transfer. Angela was a very shy little girl when she started preschool at the age of 3. There she is. She was so shy that at the school Christmas program, she stood frozen on stage like this while all the other kids were singing and dancing and having a good time. But a few years later, she broke out of that shyness. I remember the first day I noticed it. I was driving in my car, listening to a CD of the Eagles' greatest hits. All of a sudden, in the middle of Heartache Tonight, I heard this loud, raucous, raspy, Janis Joplin-like voice singing along. I had to stop the car and turn around and look to see who this stranger was in the back seat of my car. It was the not-so-shy Angela. I'm not very good at this. There. She was very smart and was accepted into the gifted programs in grade school, middle school, and high school. After high school, she attended community college and the University of Illinois. She was musically talented too, playing both the trumpet and viola. Funny story about Angela. She loved music. She went to the Bonnaroo Music Festival in Tennessee one year. Paul McCartney was the headliner. She loved the Beatles, as do I. Our favorite song was Hey Jude. Anyway, McCartney had been singing for over 3 hours and still hadn't sung Hey Jude. So Angela has to pee in the worst way. So rather walking to the porta potty and waiting in line with the chance of missing her song, she asks her friends to form a circle around her. She squats down and takes care of business. And finally, she got to hear her song. Interestingly, Hey Jude was the #1 song of 1968, the year I graduated from high school, exactly 25 years before Angela was even born. She started working in the cornfields in Illinois at the age of 14, then at a multiplex movie theater where she worked her way up to manager, and finally as a waitress while attending the U of I. Angela loved to watch TV, movies, and to read. She loved SpongeBob SquarePants. She had seen every episode and could watch it all day long. She watched the complete Lost series 3 times, had a Lost encyclopedia, and even a Lost tattoo. She never missed an episode of Survivor and dreamed of being a contestant on that show. Zac Efron was her favorite actor. And she loved reading Harry Potter books. Angela was very popular. She was unique. She was a trendsetter. Everybody said she was so cool. But not only that, she had a way of making other people feel cool. She had a way of making everyone feel welcome around her. People that didn't fit in felt like they did fit in when they were around her. Her friends told me that she was the life of the party, that the party really didn't get started until she got there, and when she left, the party was over. She was a leader, not a follower, a trendsetter in fashion and social media. She was tweeting before anyone knew what Twitter was. She was funny. She could make you laugh until you cried or peed your pants. She was 1 in a million. She couldn't even die traditionally, as Stevens-Johnson syndrome is a 1 in a million disease. Even in death, she stood out. On the afternoon of Christmas Eve 2015, Angela called Wanpen to tell her she was sick. She thought she had pink eye. She sent her a picture of her eye. Wanpen told her it didn't look like pink eye and offered to take her to convenient care. She said she could manage and went by herself. She saw a doctor at 4 o'clock and he gave her a test for strep, which came back negative. Sorry. Thank you. He told her she had a viral infection, gave her some ointment for her eye, told her to take something for a fever and go to bed. When she got back to her apartment, she took some ibuprofen and went to bed. Later, I called to ask her if she wanted to go to Christmas Eve Mass with us. She said she didn't feel up to it. At about 9 o'clock that night, she called to ask if she could spend the night with us because she felt so bad. I picked her up at her apartment and brought her home. Her eyes were swollen. She had a sore throat. Her temperature was 103.7. I gave her some Tylenol and she went to bed. At 2 a.m., she woke me up saying, "Dad, you have to see this." I went to the bathroom where she was and she showed me the inside of her mouth. The inside of her cheeks and throat were black and blistered. I had never seen anything like it. I gave her some warm salt water to gargle and she went to bed. Then I searched the internet to see if I could find anything that resembled what I had just seen in her mouth and throat. I found nothing. She woke up a couple of hours later and gargled some more salt water. Her throat hurt. She was in pain. I gave her some more Tylenol. Christmas morning, I got up at sunrise to check on her. Her condition had worsened. Her eyes were swollen, sore. Her throat was very sore. Her face and neck were swollen. She was hungry, and tried to eat some canned peaches, but even they hurt too much to swallow. I decided to take her back to convenient care. A nurse practitioner looked at her right away. By this time, she had developed a rash that covered her upper torso. The nurse said, "You need to get her to the ER ASAP. I'll call ahead and let them know you're coming." On the way to ER, Angela said, "Why does this have to happen on Christmas Day? We're supposed to be with the family today." Typical Angela, thinking of her others instead of herself. The ER was expecting her, and she saw a doctor right away. Soon there were 5 doctors looking at her, trying to figure out what was wrong with her. It was like an episode of the old TV show House, where Dr. House and his team of doctors would brainstorm and try to diagnose rare cases. One doctor said maybe she had mono. Another said measles. Another said mumps. And finally, a Dr. Hill told me Angela had the symptoms of Stevens-Johnson syndrome, and they may have to send her to a burn unit in St. Louis, Chicago, or Indianapolis, the closest cities to our home in Champaign, Illinois. However, it was decided that she should stay there in ICU. Oh, how I wish I had pushed for them to send her to Barnes Hospital in St. Louis. Maybe the outcome would have been different. Angela arrived in ICU a little before noon. By this time, the outer skin on her lips had dried up and peeled off. Her eyes were badly swollen, almost shut. Her face was swollen, her chest hurt, and her throat hurt so bad that swallowing was intolerable. They began giving her morphine for the pain. The morphine took the pain away from her eyes and chest, but not from her throat. They were afraid of giving her too much, saying it might affect her breathing. As you can see in this picture, she still had her sense of humor. Meanwhile, back home, Wanpen was preparing Christmas dinner for 17 people, including her 95-year-old mother, who she had to pick up at the nursing home that morning. Angela had wanted her grandma to be there, thinking that this might be her grandma's last Christmas. In fact, it was. Wanpen's mother died the following December. Had we known the seriousness of Angela's condition at this time, we would have canceled Christmas dinner, and Wanpen would have spent the day with Angela and me at the hospital. Her cousins, her brother, and his girlfriend came by to visit her. She was still in a lot of pain, but the visitors cheered her up, and she was joking with them. A little later, Wanpen and her 2 sisters came by to see her. Before Wanpen left, she told Angela she loved her, and Angela said, "I love you too." Those were the last words she ever spoke to her mother. After that, Angela's pain worsened. She was screaming every time she had to swallow, and eventually the doctor gave her more morphine, which seemed to help. By this time, skin was peeling off the backs of her ears, the palms of her hands, and her arms. But still, she was texting her friends and half joking about what was happening to her body and asking them to come visit her. Here you can see she came up with the perfect acronym for SJS. I spent the night with her. I remember looking out the window that night before I fell asleep. The sky was clear and there was a full moon. At 5 a.m. the next morning, the doctor woke me up. He told me that what I was seeing happening to her outer skin was happening inside her body. "She's burning from the inside out," he said. "Her lungs are full of fluid. We need to intubate her, put her on a ventilator, and drain the fluid, or she won't be able to breathe." This is when I first realized we could lose her, and I completely broke down sobbing uncontrollably. When I finally got my composure, I went to see her before they sedated her. I could see that skin was peeling off her face now. I told her what the doctor was going to do and told her I loved her. She said, "I know, I love you too." Those were the last words she ever spoke. Her face and the sound of her voice from that moment in time remain with me to this day. Later that evening, when the doctor came back for his shift, he was encouraged because she hadn't gotten any worse. But they still did not know what was causing this. They still thought it might be measles or mumps. She was in an airborne isolation room, and they put her on a wide array of antibiotics, hoping that one of them would work. The fact that she wasn't getting any worse made us feel a little better, but then later on, they told us her kidneys were failing, and they'd have to put her on a continuous dialysis machine to filter the blood for her kidneys. The rest of her organs were weakening, but her heart was still strong. So now, finally, they said, "We need to get her to Barnes Hospital in St. Louis." But there was a problem. There were severe thunderstorms and rare December tornado warnings. The helicopters would not fly. And they said she was in such a fragile state that she probably wouldn't survive a 3-hour ambulance ride to St. Louis. Remember earlier I said before I went to sleep Christmas night that the sky was clear and there was a full moon? Why didn't the doctors let go of their egos and send her to St. Louis when Dr. Hill first diagnosed her with SJS? The next day they ruled out that it was an airborne disease and took her out of isolation. They narrowed down the antibiotics to treat it as a bacterial infection and now possibly Kawasaki syndrome. They gave her IVIG to try to help her immune system to fight it. Later in the day, they told us her kidneys had failed and she was getting more and more fragile. Her lungs continued to fill up with fluid and her blood was not getting enough oxygen to sustain her organs. They suggest that she be put on an ECMO to oxygenize her blood. They told us that the surgery to hook up the ECMO was extremely risky and that in her fragile state, she might not survive the trip in her gurney from ICU on the 7th floor down to the OR on the 1st floor. And that if she did survive, she might not survive the trip back up to ICU. So our choice was to do nothing with little chance of survival or attempt this risky surgery to give her and the doctors more time to fight the infection. The surgery was a success. Tim, Wanpen, and I, and the many visitors as well as a tremendous following on Facebook were greatly encouraged by this, thinking that if she could survive this, she could survive anything. When the doctor told us she survived the surgery, we were all hugging and high-fiving each other. However, the next day, December 28th, things got worse. The doctors were more or less back to square one in fighting this mysterious disease. They still didn't know what it was and weren't sure if it was bacterial or viral. At 4 a.m. that morning, they checked to see if her pupils responded to light as they did every 4 hours. They did, but at 8 a.m., they no longer responded to light. By this time, the weather was good enough for an aircraft to fly. Barnes Hospital said that they would send one of their planes to pick her up But first they wanted her doctors to do a CT scan on her brain to check for brain activity. They did, and the CAT scan showed multiple pockets of blood in her brain. She was brain dead. We were left with the decision that no one wants to make, leaving her on life support or letting her die. Juan Penn and I went to Angela, held her hand, and said our goodbyes. We told our family and the many friends in the waiting room that they could do the same. When everyone had said their goodbyes, we asked the doctors to turn off the life support, and we waited until her heart stopped beating at 6:01 p.m., December 28th, 2015. After multiple diagnoses throughout these 4 days, the doctors now believe that Angela succumbed to Stevens-Johnson syndrome / toxic epidermal necrolysis. They think that it may have been triggered by ibuprofen. I might add that she'd been taking ibuprofen since she was an infant, with no incident. At Angela's visitation, we asked for donations for SJS research. The visitation lasted 5 hours. Like I said, she was very popular. We received nearly $10,000 that night. The funeral director told us he had never seen so many envelopes in all his years. A few months later, our son Tim had a benefit concert and raised another $5,000. When I began my research for an institution to send our donations to, I found very little SJS research being done in the U.S. I first contacted Jean McCauley of the SJS Foundation. She said their purpose was to raise awareness and to give support and information to survivors and their families. She did not know of anyone doing research specifically for SJS. I found a link online to an international SJS workshop that was held in Washington, D.C., hosted by Dr. Terry Manolio. I contacted Dr. Manolio, our friend, Terry. One of the many things she told me that some of the most promising work was being done in Thailand. Since Juan Penn is Thai, we considered that. But we decided that we wanted to keep the money in the United States for research. There were 68 participants involved in that very first SJS conference, and I emailed every one of them, searching for someone willing to do some dedicated research in the field of SJS. I got a few responses, but the most promising one was from Dr. Elizabeth Phillips at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. In subsequent emails from Dr. Phillips, we received a preliminary proposal for her intentions to start SJS-TEN research. She invited us to come visit her at VUMC, which we did. We were surprised when we got there that not only did we meet Dr. Phillips, but also her entire team, and had a roundtable discussion. They talked to us about their intentions for an hour and a half, then gave us an extensive tour of their labs. At that time, we had accumulated $16,000 in donations. It seemed like an insignificant amount to us in the world of research, where millions of dollars are spent. But they were impressed and encouraged by our grassroots endeavors and said, "It's a start." After that, we started a GoFundMe account, and so did our son Tim. In December of 2016, nearly a year after Angela died, we drove back down to Nashville and presented a check for $22,000 to Dr. Phillips and her team at VUMC for their SJS-TEN research. Coincidentally, that's $1,000 for every year of Angela's shortened life. We have since raised and donated over $100,000 to the SJSTEN Research Fund in memory of Angela at VUMC. This is Angela's website, where you can read more about her. You will also find a link on the home page where you can donate. Also, due to our grassroots advocacy and fundraising, Dr. Phillips has since been able to receive large grants from the NIH. We met with Dr. Phillips last year in Nashville and discussed their research progress and their plans for research in the future. I asked her how things had changed since starting the research. She told me that at the time of Angela's death, the SJSTEN mortality rate was 30%. Now it's 15%. We have been asked before, how do you handle your grief? Everyone handles grief differently. We like to talk about Angela, bittersweet as it may be. We love hearing others tell stories about her and their remembrances of her, especially those stories that Angela never wanted us to know about. Some people will avoid talking about her when they're around us. I guess they're afraid of bringing up a bad memory or making us sad. But that's silly. We never stop thinking about her. We wake up thinking about her. We go to bed thinking about her. We'll never forget. Why would we want to? Some people will try to say things to comfort you. Well, she's in a better place now. Not comforting. Maybe for your 95-year-old grandma, but not for a beautiful 22-year-old college student. Then there's, at least you've got your son. Again, not helpful. Someone used the analogy of losing your thumb. You learn to adapt to it, but it's never the same. It's not something you get over. You just manage to get through it. Life goes on. You just have extra baggage to carry with you. When I was invited here to speak, I was a bit apprehensive. It's a difficult story to tell. My purpose in coming in here was to make you laugh a little, to make you cry, to encourage you. I have an idea that you spend a lot of your research time looking at samples, or on your computer, or looking at statistics, or compiling your own statistics. You may lose sight of those samples and statistics are real people. My job today has been to put a human face on all of that. Maybe it would be a good idea for you to put a picture of Angela or someone else that has suffered or is suffering from a condition you are working on at your desk, workstation, or on your computer to encourage you and remind you why you're doing what you're doing. And as for that, I personally thank you for what you're doing. You're saving lives. Thank you for having me today.
So for once, I don't have much to say, so let's take a break. We've got about 20 minutes, I think. Was it 10:30? We'll come back at 10:50. But thank you, Mr. Anderson. That was really heartwarming. And anyway, all right.